Alright, this video is going to be a fairly rough but still hopefully informational overview of applying texture maps into your shaders within Maya. I'm going to be using Arnold shader for the most part, and we'll just look at a few things about putting in texture maps in general and how to control them better, and staying inside of Maya for more of it rather than doing a ton of back and forth between Photoshop and Maya. But we'll also try to actually create like a label on this pen clip using Photoshop to line up the label with the UVs. So first of all, before I get into surfacing stuff, I have an IBL with an HDR image, which I downloaded from hdrihaven.com. And I also have, in addition to that, just two Arnold area lights that have a little bit of a yellow tint, and I turned up the intensity enough that I can see it in my scene. This one I turned off the casting shadows because I didn't want too many shadows. So if I were to render this, which also, if you look at my resolution here, I turned down my resolution quite a lot because I don't want to spend forever to see updates to my render. I want to save the big, nice resolution for at the end when I am done and I want to render my presentation quality renders. So here's what this looks like just with, Lambert 1 applied and those three lights in my scene. Now, I'm just going to kind of focus on one piece for the time being so that we can just look at one piece and not necessarily have to look at all these different materials. I'm not going to go over much of the material property type stuff that if you're in my class, I went over that in class, and it's fairly easy to figure out on your own. And so I'm going to hide most of these parts, and I'm going to hide this and this and this. I really just want to focus on this thing, because this is going to also have the interesting label on the front. Now, obviously, the other thing, aside from lighting, is make sure that your object is UV'd. So I have mine, this is what I did in the other video earlier, and I have this UV shell here, which I just realized I probably want to flip around because I'm looking at it from this angle, so it makes more sense to have it flip the other way. There's a back piece here. That's just how I decided to split this up, and then I have this thing over here. So I might pause the video real quick and make a tiny little bit of edits to this. I don't want this video to be about UVs. Alright, so I paused the video and I messed with my UVs a little bit. So I kind of I made this going in the right direction, first of all, so that the label will actually be facing the right way. And I also shrunk down this inside part of this, and I split it off and I made it smaller so that it's not taking up as much of my UV space. And that should make this a little bit easier to texture that when we get to that part. Now, I'm going to close my UV editor, deleted all my history and stuff. So, first of all, let's just talk putting in a texture image for something like creating, like surface scratches or surface disruptions, little scuffs, little smudges, dust, little marks, stuff like that. So I'm going to apply, of course, an Arnold shader, first of all. So an Arnold Standard Surface shader. I'll call this, pen clip. Clip. And maybe I want to call this like matte for material or something more specific, because I also have a pen clip model. And I'm going to real quick just kind of adjust get this kind, the color closer to what I want this to look like, because this was like a black plastic. I'm not going to have any transmission because I don't want this to be transparent. I'm not going to have any metalness because I don't want this to be metal, so it's just a plastic. Now what I'm going to do is probably put in some textures for specular roughness, potentially even weight, but probably just specular roughness, and some bump map in there to start off with. So if I have also this one part right here is going to be a little bit intentionally simplified, so I'm just going to kind of put an image into the whole roughness channel without specifically lining it up with the UVs at first, which is not necessarily the best idea if you want to get around seams or just generally to match up the texture correctly. But just for the sake of demonstration, I'm just going to load in a kind of scratch grunge map texture into here without being very specific with it. So if you want to download textures from the internet that are good, you might want to check out somewhere like Polygon, which is technically a subscription site. You can do a free trial for a little bit, but their textures are really high quality, and they have a whole bunch of different categories. Like they specifically have surface imperfections category, which is what I'm going to be using one of. There's also Texturize, which has a whole bunch of different images available that are nice looking, and textures.com, which also has tons of images available. And of course, when in doubt, you can always take your own custom textures so that your artwork stands out a little bit more than just downloading images that everybody else uses. But we're not here to discuss that for the time being. So anyway, I'm gonna basically use some textures that I downloaded from various sites. So I might use something like this, which is kind of like a dirt wipe texture, or there's some, this one's a bit too subtle. I don't think I'm going to use that one. But that is a good thing to note, is that a lot of this doesn't need to be like incredibly hyper detailed. I might use this. So Dust Wipes 003, remember that. And anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into my specular roughness for right now, and I'm going to plug in File, and I'm going to be a bad worker and just go directly to this texture library folder instead of putting this in my project folder, just because I'm kind of still experimenting for right now. And I'm going to load in this one, and now you automatically want to see what happens in your render view before you do anything else. And it would render this. It doesn't particularly look like much is going on when I put that texture in there. And one of the reasons for that is because if I open up my Hypershade, just click that button right there, and I look at my map, my material out here. I'm going to close this. I don't need that. We can see that my dust texture is being sent the alpha channel into the specular roughness. And this doesn't actually have an alpha channel because it's a JPEG. So I might be able to see a difference if I check on alpha is luminance, which means that it will look at the black and white color values and read those in. And this is very subtle. Technically, it's showing up. But since my image is pretty dark overall, so if we go back to the image, my image is fairly dark overall, and in terms of numbers, like 0 to 1 binary numbers, black is equal to 0 and white is equal to 1. And there's not really that much actual white on here, and there's a little bit of gray, but it's overall very dark. So most of my specular roughness is still going to be equivalent to 0, which if you play around with the material settings, having your specular roughness at 0 means it is completely pristine and sharp specular highlights with no roughness to it whatsoever. Oops, I was trying to hit 3, and I accidentally hit 3 in here, which does something different. So my issue is kind of that there's a lack of contrast. Now, before I go any further, I just want to give you a tip, and that is if you're not sure if your texture image is showing up properly, it's always a good idea to check out. If I take this and I plug it into the base color, can I see the image in the color channel? And the answer here is yes, I can see it in the color channel, but even in the color channel, it looks very, subtle. So it's definitely going to be very subtle on my specular roughness. And also, just out of curiosity, I may turn down the specular completely, and now I can just see that plugged into the color. Obviously, with the specular weight turned down, the specular roughness doesn't matter at all. But so I have a few options. One is that I can load this in Photoshop and edit it and increase the contrast there. But I want to kind of stay in Maya as much as possible. So what I am going to do instead of editing this outside of Maya is I might disconnect this from the base color. So I'm just going to go like that, and then I'll make the base color something that's more easily visible. What I'm going to do is on my texture image right here, I'm going to go down to Effects, and I'm going to say Insert Color Remap. Actually, before I do that, I might just, out of curiosity, yeah. So if I click Invert now, most of it is white, and white equals high roughness. So now almost my whole thing looks very rough. So we do know that it is working. It's just that there's not enough contrast. Anyway, I'm going to hit Color Remap, and that'll bring me this ramp. And what's happening in here is that it's not actually being connected to my my shader right now. So it's sending the color from this into this Remap RGB to HSV, or hue shade value. And oh, I don't want to touch that. And then this is getting plugged in automatically to this Remap ramp, which is basically going to allow me to adjust the levels, so to speak, of my image directly in Photoshop. In Maya. So what I want to do is not have this connected anymore, but instead I can just take the alpha of this and plug that into the specular roughness. And at first, if I just render this, it's probably not going to look that much different. This is still taking a little bit longer to render than I would have hoped. And what I can do is I can play around with the ramp colors here, and we can see that I'm increasing. If I lower this, the image becomes more white overall, and if I increase this, we can see that the darker areas get increased. So it functions very similarly to adjusting the levels in Photoshop. So if I want my thing to be mostly shiny but have some areas that are rougher than others, I can maybe do something like this and see how that turns out. Now this is still being a little bit subtle. I might also plug this still into the base color, and because what I see here isn't necessarily what I'm getting. So you have to be a little bit careful not to jump the gun here. So I'm not particularly liking that. Let's take a step back here. I'm going to deconnect the specular roughness, and I am going to turn on, and I'm also going to do what I did before and just turn off the specular completely. And I'm going to run my IPR so I can see this in real time. So what I'm doing, again, is the same thing I did before. I'm just looking at this in the color and not in the specular. And then once I'm satisfied with that, I can try plugging it back to the specular again. So if I lower this back down, I can start to see more of the white areas. And so this is a little interesting. If you click this arrow right here, you can actually open up your ramp in a bigger view. And you may have to get a little bit more extreme than you might have originally thought in terms of how this ramp is set up. And again, apparently this is not a very good representation of of what your texture is going to show up as. So I would just try using this kind of look at the color technique instead. And again, you have to get the hang of kind of visualizing, okay, these white areas are going to be rough, the black areas are still going to be shiny. And I do want it to be largely still pretty specular. I don't want it to be too rough because it is still shiny plastic. But this is now I know that, you know, it's a little bit easier to tell what's going on if you work like this. So now I'm going to disconnect this. My computer is having a little bit of a hard time because of all the stuff that I'm doing here, plus running the IPR, which honestly I might pause and just plug in the out alpha into the specular roughness right here. Make sure that this is not completely black, because it'll be a little hard to see. In fact, I might make this a more interesting color just for this demonstration purposes. And do you need... Should I not have... Turn it on here. Okay, I paused that. I realized what the problem was, and that is I had turned down my specular weight to check before, so the specular roughness was not actually doing anything. Whoopsies. And again, my computer is lagging a little bit because of trying to render all this. But now you can see that we are getting those cool areas of roughness loaded in there. And if I look at this from a further away angle, I can still see those now. And again, the point here isn't to like have your object look so beat up that it's like covered in scratches on every square inch of it. But the more surface imperfections that we have on there, the better. And I could try putting the same thing into my bump map. So I'm going to actually do this manually. So normally if I were to go to geometry in my shader and say bump mapping, it would ask me, and I might want to create, you know, a file, and it'll automatically create this bump 2D node here and plug it into the normal camera. But this, I don't necessarily need to like bring in a new file, so I might just delete these two things. And I could try taking, if I take this and plug it in, ooh, you want to say alpha of that too, then this might look a little crazy at first because it's a bit too much of a bump. But if I turn the bump value down significantly, in fact, I may even go lower than that. I'm not entirely sure why it's giving me such dark bump depth. It seems a little over the top. So it never hurts to go very, very small with your bump value if you need it. And again, you know, perhaps that's a little overkill, so maybe I might want to use a different, maybe I don't actually want to use this for my bump map, maybe I'd want to use something else so that I'm not relying on the same thing. But the point is that you can use, reuse maps that are already in Maya for various different attributes without necessarily having to constantly bring in a new version of the image. If I wanted to, I could even try bringing this in instead and seeing if that looks any different. And that might actually be a little bit better than using the hyper adjusted one. Do I need to have, I don't know if I need to have alpha is luminance turned on for this bump, but it never hurts to check. And anyway, so again, if I was doing this in a more serious way, I would probably bring in this my UV snapshot into Photoshop and align it on there, because right now you can see that you know, where those smudges and everything are touching my UVs is completely out of my control. It's just up to how the image is laid out in a square. So I don't have too much control over this. So I would highly recommend actually kind of being a little bit more precise with putting your splotches and scratches on here. Although here's one more trick for you while we're at it. I'm going to go into my Place 2D Texture node, which always is attached to a file, and I'm going to repeat UV, and maybe I'll repeat that, you know, 5 in the U and 5 in the V. And you can see what's happened is that it starts tiling the image. So, you know, one instance of this image is only like here right now. And then it starts repeating it over and over again. So I can make my overall image kind of smaller, but repeat more times. And that will kind of make the detail a little bit smaller, but also spread it out a little bit more over the surface of my object here. So that can be a way of distributing your textures a little bit more evenly over the surface. All right, so speaking of the UV editor, let's try one. Oh, that's my that's my backdrop. Let's try one more thing while we're here, and that is putting the logo on this pen clip. So I am going to go to Image, UV Snapshot while I have my clip selected. This is gonna go to my Images folder, so I'll call this pen clip UVs, and I'm going to save this as 4K. I'm going to save it as a PNG so it's transparent, and make the lines black so that they're easier to see, and apply and close. I'm going to leave the Hypershade open, and I'm going to leave you open, but I am going to go to Photoshop and create a new document. And I'm going to create a 4K document in Photoshop directly instead of opening that PNG, because I don't want any like PNG artifacting to be left. And let me do this. My computer seems to be going a little slow still. And so I have this, and now I can say place embedded, and not this. Where is my image? Pen, images, and pen clip UVs. It'll be a little hard to see because this is a very large image and the lines are not that thick, but they're there. And luckily for me, I went ahead a little bit, and I already actually I may have to look in a different folder for this. Here we go. Oh, hold on a sec. Let me pause the video. Okay, I technically have it in a different folder, so I'm going to open this up here. And basically, this is I took a close-up image of my pen, the same one I believe I showed earlier. If I didn't show it, then I will show it again. So I had a close-up image of my pen that I took that looks like this. And in Photoshop, what I did was I trimmed it down and cropped it just to this. And then I used masking, so I created a mask, and I kind of masked out all of that except for the text itself. And there's still a little bit of weirdness going on here. Like, I don't necessarily like having the specular highlight in the photo, so that's not necessarily ideal. But for my purposes right now, I'm just gonna take this and I'm gonna drag it into my UV scene, and I'm going to Control T and kind of put that on top of my UVs right here. And I want my UVs to be on top so I can see them. If you want, you might want to try putting a stroke on your UVs so that you can see them a little bit better, and then maybe get rid of it later. So that's just an easier way to see my UVs for right now. But if I put this, around here somewhere, then I can see exactly where it's going to be on my object. And then I might make another layer underneath that, and I'm going to say Edit, Fill, and no, not white. I want this. I don't want to do black either. I want it to be more of like a dark, very dark gray, but not necessarily totally black. And if I'd like to try to clean up some of this specular, I might be able to do that using various Photoshop tools, such as perhaps the burn tool. I can try, and oh, this is set to shadows. Let me go to highlights. I might have to undo a few clicks there. I don't want this to be like too dark compared to the rest of it, but I might be able to get rid of some of that. I just don't really want any specular highlights in my image, because I want all of the lighting to come from Maya and not necessarily from the image itself. Because I don't want, if I look at this from another angle that this lighting doesn't make sense, then it's going to make my texture seem weird. And so, yeah, that's just a quick example. I'm going to turn off my UVs, and I'm going to save this. This should go into my project source images folder. And I can say pen, clip, color. And I can save this out as a JPEG or something, but I could also just load in the Photoshop document. I might save this as a Targa file, which just is a little bit better quality than a JPEG. And you know the drill at this point. I'm going to go into my color file and go to my source images and put that bad boy in there. Now, I will, I may have to change how this is laid out if I don't like it, but due to the fact that my UVs were properly lined up earlier, I shouldn't, it's showing up pretty much in the correct place that I would want it to be in. And there we go. Now I may want this this printed on logo to be slightly raised off of the surface. So let's try something a little bit experimental while we're still in this video. It's already half an hour long, but hey, I might as well do this while I'm still recording. So I want this to be used as my bump map. So what I might be able to do is, in my Photoshop document, I maybe will kind of group this, and this can be called color, and then I can duplicate this group and call it bump. And in the bump map, I can, this I would want to say fill, and probably have this just be 50% gray, which in bump map terms is just neutral or nothing. And on the logo here, I can go to my adjustments, and I can perhaps oh, actually, you know what I'm going to do here? I'm just going to do a color overlay. Effect. And I will make this like light gray. And so now this part will stick up in the bump map, and the rest of it will be neutral. Oops, there's a little thing there. I'm just going to leave that there because I don't feel like fixing it right now. But so I have this bump group, and then I still have the color map. And now I can save my Photoshop document. I can save this as pen clip bump. Now I already have a bump map on my shader from earlier when I put in the grungy texture. But check this out. So I'm gonna I do actually want my browser back. Wait, which one of you? Here. I'm gonna create, and I'm gonna look for layer, and I'm gonna do a layered texture. And this is gonna be a little complicated, but trust me. So I'm going to take this out alpha, and I'm going to plug that into, or I guess it wants me to do the color this time, that into input 1. Oh, actually here I can do this, of this layer, and then I can make a new layer just by clicking in here. Oh, I don't actually want all of those, I'm going to delete them. And this one I can plug in its own file, and I will put in pen clip bump. And my layered texture now has this going into it and this going into it at the same time. And what I can do in here is set this to add. And now if you look closely, I have the gray multiplying with the dust wipe. And maybe I could play with having a few different kinds. I don't know if there's a way to rearrange the layers, which is a little annoying. So I might take this and try doing that again, but this time I'll put them in reverse order. So this one can be over. Don't want to multiply. Difference. It's going to be a little bit weird because everything is black and white. That's not exactly what I wanted. Let's just do add for now. Anyway, I'm going to take out alpha of this, and now have that going into the bump map. And this may end up being having been a weird experiment that doesn't go very well, but at least we gave it a shot. And it does look like it's working a little bit. So just a slight bump there, and I can see that this is getting raised just a tiny little bit off of the surface, which is all I really need because this is getting printed onto the surface, and it would be raised only a little tiny bit. Anyway, so I think that's going to wrap it up for this video. It already got pretty long, but without breaking up the topics into smaller chunks, that's really the only way to go about doing this. But that is the basics of putting in texture maps into your shaders, how to control your texture maps a little bit more freely in Maya without having to always go to Photoshop, and also how to use your UVs in Photoshop so you can put anything more precisely on the surface of your model. That's that's all I'm going to talk about for today. Hope this video is helpful for everybody, and that is going to be it. Good luck.